Organization isn't just a thing that happened a long time ago and then ended, right? There is this sense of a sort of economic and cultural imperialism, as it's often referred to, that is, it shapes people's lives, it changes them. But I do think that that sense of it being personal as well as social is really interesting. All right. Do you guys, in our last 7 minutes, do you want to have a quick discussion of Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial? Oh, we do? Oh, I thought we only had until 7. Oh. All right. All right. Yeah. I just have to go home and pack. Before I go here, so how many of you have seen this? So most of you know more than I do about this. I'm going to talk about its sort of art historical references primarily, because I figured you guys would probably have more experience with it than I do. So how did this get built? Anybody tell me?
So they had a contest, right? With
Yes.
Architects that were presenting a plan.
Mm-hmm.
And Maya Lin is this like young girl.
She was like a teenager, right? She was 19?
Super young.
Okay.
21.
Okay. Very young. Yes, they didn't know who she was. And she won with this proposal. So simple. So, yeah, no, she was an undergraduate. My notes say she was an undergraduate, not a graduate student. And so this is 1980 that she submits the proposal. And the war had only ended 5 years earlier, right? This was recent history when she did this, which is important. I think it's very easy to sort of look at the memorial and sort of see it as separated in time because it is so abstract. The jury was made up of architects and sculptors, which I think is important in terms of the selection that was made. So how are the names organized? By when they died. Sorry? Yeah. 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 So it gets bigger as the number of deaths goes up, and then they taper off. So why organize them like that? Why chronologically? Wouldn't that make it harder to find the person that you are looking for, your friend, your family member? Mm-hmm.
So they were each individual names, they were placed in not in a hard, I don't know, does that make sense, like this balance of individual with collective?
Yeah, yeah.
I think you're overwhelmed with the idea that there's almost 15,000 names.
Yeah.
Whatever. But it also shows you how it escalates, because it's not just like, I'll build the wall and then we'll carve the names. It's like, the wall's this thin here because on this day or in this month, this many people died, and
Yeah.
this many people died, and you see those deaths escalating, and the deaths dictate the height of the wall, not
The depth of the cut into the earth, yeah. So there is this sense, on the one hand, people disappear into the mass. At the same time, there's a sense of a very real sort of visceral physical effect of the sort of piling up of names.
and you see who they died with. You know, without the
Right.
medical, you don't know that this whole platoon of guys
We're connected. And,
would want to be
yeah,
connected on this wall.
right.
And I think some that they didn't know, as opposed to like the 9/11 memorial, where they, asked all of the families, where do you want these names? Who do you want them to be by?
Mm-hmm.
They placed them. They were able to meet every request.
Wow.
So here they,
Yeah.
they don't do that at all.
No. And not everybody was happy with this. You.
I was living with my uncle who was a Vietnam vet about the time and got a very different view because I thought it was really cool. I was coming from school and student had won the thing and this is just awesome and his feelings about being paralyzed in Vietnam.
About being.
Paralyzed in
Yep.
Vietnam. His feelings
right?
My husband was drafted out of law school right before the war told him.
Hmm.
When he went because he wasn't going to move to Canada. And it was soothing and so, because it changed his life forever.
Mm-hmm.
And he came back a different political animal and how he saw life. And he wasn't going to go to war, and this spoke to him spiritually. And I personally, you might think, I think your move, just approaching it and then walking through it, is really, to me, a physical and essentially spiritual and very emotional thing. And to watch the people with their faces, go find the kid like the high school shot. And I think it's phenomenal.
Well, the criteria, it could not be political. So you think
Right.
about something that was only political, really, I mean, it would have to be abstract to be able to meet that requirement.
I think it has been absolutely good. For my Uncle Ronnie, it was me.
Yeah.
You know, when he went to see it, and its physical presence is huge.
And this is one of the things that, and I've included images here to sort of help work through this. This is a work that is very contemporary. It's drawing on, say, minimalist art practices from the previous decade, where these are works that sort of reach out to the viewer physically. This idea of a sort of phenomenological experience. You're not just looking at a thing on a pedestal and reading its iconography. You are having a physical experience with it in the space. And so with minimalism, that was very abstract. It was like, yes, you're in the space with the cube, feel the cube, or the giant, steel wall. But with this, it was tied to actual loss and actual names and actual history. And it was an incredibly effective use of what had been a very abstract sort of aesthetic approach. So we can see works like Michael Heiser's Double Negative, Earthworks influencing her, this idea of making a monument by cutting into the ground, which certainly was not how it was done historically.
Yeah, the Washington Monument in the back.
Yeah, yeah. Even that polished surface where you see yourself in the object, it shows you yourself. Is again, she's drawing on these objects that had engaged this mode without any real interest in sort of communicating a specific meaning other than the experience. We also, I think it's interesting to compare it to Onkawara's work. So are you guys familiar with Onkawara? He had a project where he would send a telegram or a postcard. So he'd send a telegram to a friend every morning that said, I got up at 7:30 this morning. I might be mixing up the telegrams and the postcards, but bear with me. So the postcards would say, I woke up at 7:30 this morning. The telegram would say, I am still alive. Right? Every day. Sent one every day. He also made date paintings every day until he died, where it would be a painting, and on the canvas he would paint that day's date that he painted it every day. And this project is 1 million years past. There's also 1 million years future. So it's just this, it's a collection of books, volumes. And each page is printed with a year, right? But it's 1 million years past from the moment when they were published in 1969. And so here you have this sort of massive collection of data organized chronologically. But again, like those minimalist objects, it doesn't really mean anything except time. And here she's sort of borrowing that strategy of this sort of chronology, this built up, this sense of massiveness it produces. But she's using it with people's names and people's lives. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's a brilliant work as an art historian, and also kind of in the way that I think we now are able to talk about the Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
But why was she chosen? I don't understand. Obviously, why?
I think she was chosen because, as I said, the jury was made of architects and artists and sculptors. They recognized the language that she was speaking. No, they came in later.
So they didn't know she was a woman or young or beautiful.
No. Is she Vietnamese? I know she's Asian, but I think her family is Chinese, right? Yeah. But the assumption was made. Basically, it was like she's an Asian woman, and there was some like very ugly language used to describe her by people who were unhappy with her selection. But again, how did she deal with it? I think she stayed pretty cool. She didn't put herself in the public eye very much, and I do think things got quite difficult at a certain point. She's Chinese. Yeah, her family's Chinese. Yeah. Yeah. So there is this sort of, one of the problems was that the committee was made up of people who were looking for good art, not people who were speaking for the families or for veterans. So it was part of the problem initially. So when it was proposed, this idea that it was a scar in the earth, her identity was a problem. The nature of the monument was a problem. Now I want to talk a little bit about anti-Vietnam War politics and art.
Yeah, because you have that image up, you can see the Washington Monument
Yeah.
reflected. I think the two arms do point at the Washington and the Lincoln, which was another one of the criticisms, that it looked as though she was saying the philosophies and ideologies at the beginning of this country have taken us to this point.
Huh.
Fed right into,
Right.
and some people saw that as a
Right. I don't think she actually was.
intended.
No.
Well, just the way it's situated, it would have
Yeah.
it would have
She
to.
has aligned it with those monuments
Yes.
so that they come to the center.
Yes.
It was Ross Perot, I think, who was campaigning at the time and called it I was just looking for the quote, something like a waiting wall of shame or something. It was a horrible
Yeah.
statement.
Well, I mean, part of that, the furor about it was heightened by the fact that the Vietnam War was a particularly controversial one. So World War II, America came back heroic, right? Like saved the day. The bad guys were so clearly and obviously the bad guys. It was really easy to draw clear moral and ethical distinctions and to feel like heroes. The Vietnam War was so much more complicated. And we're going to look at a couple of works by artists who really ask the American public to question the status of being a hero and what does it mean to be a good guy. So the first is Martha Rosler's Bringing the War Home, House Beautiful. So here we see soldiers on the right, and then here a Vietnamese person holding a naked baby, clearly in distress. But they've been put in nice American homes, right? These are images from home decorating magazines that she's collaged in images from like Time and Life news magazines. So why would she do that? Why would you stick images from the war in these homes? Yeah.
One of the problems with the Vietnam War is that the nation wasn't mobilized or in support of it. So the soldiers are off for 365 days of foreign tour, and everyone back home is going to college and having fun, and they're completely disconnected with the war. Whereas in World War II, we have full mobilization.
Yeah.
But we also watched the war on TV.
Yeah.
Dinner.
Yes. This sense of, I've read descriptions from people who had this experience. I was like watching TV and there's footage of the war and carnage and it's awful. And then it's an ad for a refrigerator and then an ad for spaghetti and I'm eating my TV dinner and it's this bizarre sort of conflation of worlds that previously had been kept separate. So it's often referred to as the living room war. Right? This sense of that what was happening overseas was being experienced at home in weirdly comfortable settings by people who are going to school and living their lives and relatively comfortable. Yeah.
Just to note, these two pieces were in the BYU Museum of Art in that home exhibit.
Ah,
Just that
recently?
a couple months ago, I saw these like.
Ah, awesome. Did they also have ones from her more recent series? Because she's. Okay, because she's made them more recently about American interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it is one of the things that starts to stand out looking at those more recent ones. With these ones, it's the domestic sphere, and with the more recent ones, she's drawing connections between like the world of fashion and commodity culture and the sort of horrors of war. And it's like I've noticed at a certain point, she's really kind of coming down hard on women, American women, who were at home and comfortable and enjoying the sort of decadence and pleasures of a domestic lifestyle or of shopping while this is going on. I don't think it's intentional on her part. I think it's just the imagery that was around at the time. But the politics of gender in these works are pretty interesting. Okay, so the next image you may be familiar with, but it's a little rough, just a heads up. It's difficult. So this is a poster that the Art Workers Coalition made. They made thousands of them and put them up all over the place. And they used a photograph that was taken at My Lai by an American at My Lai, who he was the official photographer, and he had his official black and white camera, and then he had his own color camera. And he took pictures, and then he made them public when he came home. He provided them to news magazines, and it was Life magazine. And the text, question and babies, answer and babies, is from an interview that Mike Wallace, so you guys know Mike Wallace, old news guy, he did an interview with another one of the men who was present for the My Lai massacre and participated in the My Lai massacre, Paul Meadlow. And Meadlow said, you know, we killed everyone in this village, everyone. And Wallace asked him, and babies? And he said, and babies, right? So this interview was a real turning point. These photographs in this interview were a real turning point in the war. This is where that sort of the history of World War II, the atrocities of the Germans, suddenly began to sort of shift in terms of American self-perception. These are piles of bodies of women and children and babies. And there were further details in these interviews that came out that were really horribly distressing. And so they took this question in this photograph and they put it everywhere, right? And their goal is to ask Americans to say, no, we don't want to be doing this. We want out of this particular conflict. We're worried that we're becoming the bad guys. We need to get out. And so this is the social and sort of intellectual and discursive world in which she makes this work, right? So this, Mai Lin's memorial, its sort of apolitical nature, is compared to works such as the Art Workers Coalition poster, which really pull no punches. So this idea it can't be political, I don't think that necessarily means it can't have representation. And there is another work that was introduced to sort of go with this for people who wanted something more figurative. Yeah.
Was that part of her?
No. She wanted nothing to do. Let me find them. Here they are. She wanted nothing to do with this. And initially, the people who proposed this wanted to put it like at the top. Like it was going to go here. Can you see my arrow? Anyway, right here. It's going to go right there. And she and the sort of committee behind this were like, no. So why the resistance, do you think, to the figurative component? Which I understand is sort of off to the side somewhere. Huh.
But these more or less depend on her and glorify, and I think so many people, so many of them, know about this. They didn't want that.
Right.
And it was a grieving thing. It was for our nation.
I think also this, I mean, while this is stylistically is fairly modern, in particular in terms of the appearance of the figures, the idea of sort of like three men standing together, that comes from a really long tradition of figurative sculpture that does glorify warfare and valor and martial honor and all of those things. And I think it was really important that this memorial neither seek to shame or to valorize actions of violence. Instead, it's like we have suffered a terrible, terrible loss. And this is here to help us remember it and think about it and be contemplative in our relationship to it.
I think it was also get on the wall, and then these become kind of just these generic representations of random soldiers. So
Yeah.
who are they, or did we pick 3 to say we're more? It does seem kind of a weird.
Well, these kinds of representations do tend, unless they're of a specific, like, great leader, the sort of the unknown soldier, right? This sort of nameless, generic figure that is supposed to be accessible to and represent everybody. But I think there was an understanding that for many people, that was not going to work. They didn't want, veterans who had survived didn't necessarily want to look at themselves in that way. They didn't want to look at themselves still in uniform, still carrying weapons. Some did, certainly. But for many, I think this sense of being able to go to the wall and mourn and sort of see their actual current, present reflection
So if
instead
they're
was,
all 2 years apart?
that sounds,
It says 82 for her,
uh-huh.
but that's what I wondered is if
Yeah.
it was all like unveiled and installed and open.
This was a
together.
response. It was a way to
Oh, so
deal
this
with
is
the
like
controversy.
everybody that was mad.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yes. Conciliatory.
And just a quick question, and that is, how do your students respond to this? Do you teach this?
I do. They're generally quite positive in their responses to it. I mean, I get that this is, this.
But is the war so removed from their
Oh.
experience that
It's not heated at all. I rarely see students, there's very little controversy, if that's,
do they know about the massacre?
no. Well, they do. I mean, we talk about it in class, but like it's one of the few cases where I give trigger warnings. I mean, they're really awful images. It's horrifying, but they're also an important part of American history.
I just wonder if they come to your art history class with previous knowledge from their high school history
Right.
classes, and they kind of fit.
You know, so I have a very multi-generational student body. Yeah, I should bring thank you. It's mostly young students, but then there are a number of non-traditional students, and they tend to speak up in this section on the historical material. Thank you. Thanks. Sorry? Yeah. Like when I came to America, I didn't know how My Lai was pronounced. And it was an older student who corrected me.
Do you remember that the Black movement was going on about that time too? And
The Black Power movement? Yeah, we look at them.
their cards and how
Yeah.
long you will go. So I think it's interesting. Well, and you know that they were being drafted with great percentages.
Yeah,
And that's really one of the reasons why my husband went, because they changed the policy, and they were going to take people in school, and they were going to take people that were married, and they were going to take, whatever.
to try to address the disparity in who was being sent. Yeah, we have, in my intro class, we have one lecture on the politics of dissent in the US in the 60s. So they both come up.
Being a U.S. I taught U.S. history for years, and so when we talk about the Vietnam War, I was always surprised. And of course, my students are high school, so they're younger. But I was always surprised at how they are very comfortable talking about this and saying it was a mistake or it was wrong. They're very comfortable critiquing our government and its choice to go into Vietnam in a way that maybe the old generations weren't. Because I actually think historically, this is when we began to scrutinize our government more. This is the Vietnam War with the Watergate scandal. We have the 1960s and all that counterculture. And so all of that is happening at the same time. So they're able to look at this piece in a way that is they're much more comfortable with it. Not just
Yeah.
because they're removed, but also because they're more comfortable saying, yeah, our government makes mistakes. And
Yeah.
they do bad things. You know, and we're making
Right.
it happen to them.
I mean, I think you're right that in the 60s and 70s, there's still a lot of things that weren't being talked about that were going on. Whereas today, the history of the civil rights movement has made it impossible to ignore the failures of the power system. The country came pretty close to falling apart in the 60s. Things got pretty rough. And I think you're right that really did change the conversation.
That they've grown up in, really.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. We've also seen a shift from, in terms of like left-right politics. Historically, we see sort of more conservative populations not wanting to criticize the government. And now we see increasingly an anti-government stance coming from populations that identify as conservative. So there has been a real sort of shift, I think, in how things are operating politically. I wanted to ask you guys to compare these as monuments or memorials. Well, I didn't really come up with it. The committee, the AP committee did. But they do look pretty good together. I mean, what does it mean to make a monument these days? How has our attitude towards the memorial or monument changed?
In some ways, monuments become memorials rather than glorifying. A lot of times it's being critical and pointing out things that we can learn from the past instead of just glossing over it.
So we're less likely to sort of celebrate and valorize power the way that we perhaps historically have done. Where do you think that comes from? How did we go from a culture that celebrates those in power in its art to a culture that actively sort of refuses that sort of representational culture? Or you think that's what it is?
I think that's part of it.
Yeah.
When we stop being the winner. At least, I mean, like with Vietnam and all of that stuff, how can you glorify something that, I mean, even if it had been controversial and all the loss, but we won, and we could say, well, yeah, it was bad medicine, but we won, but we didn't, we failed. So then it becomes about the loss and the sacrifice, the cost to achieve.
I think that it also has to do with the movement starting in around the 1980s of like the rise of subaltern studies. And like in the history departments across the nation, you know, it's no more great man theory. We're not doing just the victors and those great presidents and whatever, but it's about the people that it's affecting. And once you start that movement where you're looking from the bottom up kind of histories, then it naturally, like, those are not fun stories to tell. They're really tragic. And so the way that we represent ourselves, once we face those kinds of things, it naturally, I think, changes.
And it trickles down to everything. I mean, I pulled out my old art history book from 1985 and looked at who wasn't in there and who's in there now. And it's not the same text by any stretch.
No.
You know, we've become a culture of looking or trying to look and trying to recognize that there's more than just one group.
How much do you think the spread of mass media has to do with that development? I mean, there's not winning, but there's also just having a space for alternative stories to be told. I think has had a huge impact on how we.
I mean, you have like the Arab Spring, you know, that was all kind of fueled by social media. Black Lives Matter started out as a Twitter post.
Yeah.
You know, and it turned into this huge movement. It's amazing how much things catch fire and trend. And once it's trending, everybody hops on the web.
Yes. And that can go in so many different directions.
I'm curious to know from your knowledge, is this tied to the creation of memorials or I mean, I guess some of the dates here, but maybe the like kind of going quicker ahead of the availability and the access of information. That I wonder like how much the response to Vietnam was fueled by the fact that we saw what was going on. People saw what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, I mean, it's still, as I say this is sort of theoretical, although I think it's fairly widely embraced, this sense that once we could see the way that we relate to war changed. War isn't new. Mass murder isn't new. Genocide isn't new. But once we had pictures, once we had clear, precise, modern records of all of it, it became much more difficult to be celebratory in relation to it.
But I think we've become numb. I asked my student for the day, could you see what happened in Africa with the Islamic movement? Yes, because in But I said, this is what happened. They went, oh, okay. I mean, there was no affect, no reaction, nothing.
Would they have the same reaction if something like that happened locally? I mean, I do think there is a certain extent where, like, when it's far away, it takes great effort to get people to identify.
And if it's not perpetuated by
Right.
our country.
Right. Then there isn't a feeling of responsibility. Yeah. And also, they had to work really hard to get those images out. The My Lai images were, I mean, it's not like it was no big deal. They really worked hard to get that information out. It didn't just sort of go on its own. They had to convince people to care.
There's a whole process of propaganda, even in the United States. Like, it was highly used, especially in World War I and World War II. Like, the flag at Iwo Jima was the second time that they put the flag on the top of that mountain. You know, like,
In order to take the picture.
they needed a bigger flag.
Okay, at the same time, though, some of the iconic photographs of the civil rights movement that really shaped how it played out were also planned or reenacted. I mean, Rosa Parks was not the first woman to refuse to give up her seat. She was the most presentable. So that sort of use of media
I feel like it's kind of seen as lies now. Like we're so cynical, and you have so many late night talk show hosts that are going
Yes.
to just rip any propaganda.
Right. But there's also, I mean, the things with the civil rights movement, they were things that were happening, but you take a picture, you set it up if you have to have that record of what's going on. But things like the photographs of shootings, police shootings, over the last few years, can't frame that as propaganda. That's a thing that happened and somebody videotaped it. So that is definitely changing the way that we relate to power and to identity, or I hope it is. I would like to think that it is. But our sense of responsibility or being tied to something. I also think we need pictures. If you don't have pictures of what happened with Boko Haram, then you don't believe it happened. All right. I don't think we're going to, okay, so I do just want to encourage you, when you look at Faith Ringgold's, her Dancing in the Louvre, to look at some of the other images from the series. Yeah, they're amazing. This Picasso's studio, the Demoiselles d'Avignon, that elbow up. So the sense that she's placing actual black bodies back in the history that had sort of turned black bodies and African culture into sort of symbols. They weren't people, they stood in for something. And so she's sort of insisting on the presence that, no, there's actual people. This is called Joe Baker's Birthday. So it's Josephine Baker, whose history, if you're not familiar with her, it's amazing. So just, yeah, this is a great image, but the rest of them, Gertrude Stein's salon. I know, I love it. Yeah, so, yeah.
Where did you find these images that went?
I went digging around online because I saw that it was part of a series. Yeah.
And that's the
So the series is the French collection. And the one that you've been asked to work with is Dancing at the Louvre. It's number 1, part 1. But then, sorry? Yeah, is the name of this particular entry, but it's the French collection. So that one is number 1. This one, Picasso Studio, is from part 1. It's number 7. Joe Baker's Birthday is part 1, number 10, and Gertrude Stein is part 2, number 10.
So how many are there total?
I think there might be, so the first series, I think there are 8. And the second one, no, there are 10, obviously. There must be 20. I couldn't find pictures of all of them.
Does she do the quilting? Like, she really
No, she's painting and then quilting the painted surface. Yeah, but yeah.
We were just talking about production, so I was curious to know if she really did all of this herself.
Yes, this isn't a great image, but it's an earlier work. So she started as a painter, but her mother quilted, and she quilted with her mother. And she began in the 70s to make works that drew on African American craft traditions, quilting, but also African art, which we can see in the faces of these. They're life-size soft sculptures. She had some kind of, like she was a seamstress in Harlem, I think. Yeah. But there is this sort of long history of quilting and textile crafts within the African American female community. That sort of, do you guys know the quilts of Gee's Bend? Okay, we have one more minute. I have to show you the quilts of Gee's Bend. They're so beautiful. Yeah. So they're made in the 60s and 70s in this one community. Come on. Doesn't want to open. And they had a moment when they were being exhibited really widely, and people were like, they're like great modernist paintings. And the women who made them were like, no, they're quilts. They're just really nice quilts. We make really nice quilts. There is resistance to this idea of framing them in a modernist sort of aesthetic, right? But yeah, they're pretty great. All right, we're all out of time. Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was.
Here's a question. How deep is 100 million sunflower seeds?
Oh, I don't know. But it just, I mean, it was made for that room.
So they've never redisplayed, like, are they?
Not as far as I know. They've just been packed up.
So they kind of.
Yeah.
They sold them out or something.
I would think a few inches at least. Enough that, like, when people walked in them, they didn't hit the floor.
They must have something about not having people take them home.
Well, people have taken them home.
Yeah, there's plenty. They asked them to, but
Oh, thank you guys. Thanks.